I'm going to talk to you today. This is, I believe, our 12th week, 12 services, 12 Sundays, so 3 months of social distancing and 12 weeks that the world around us, for sure at least, has been quarantined. And only recently, thank God, things have begun to open back up. But I suppose in the last 3 months, there are a few people anywhere, really, who could say that they haven't been affected by the restrictions and the requirements that we see in grocery stores and literally everywhere we go. And so, if you were to ask someone 12 months ago what physical distancing was, it just wasn't part of our vocabulary. Flattening the curve, that wasn't part of our world. It just, the 2020 has brought with us new parts of our vocabulary, things that none of us had ever heard of even just 1 year ago. And today I want to talk to you about breaking the chains of isolation. And again, I want to say this. I have to say it maybe 2 or 3 times throughout this message. I am not taking this message to question or challenge any of the requirements that governments or health agencies have put upon us. I think the intent is there that a disease would not spread, that a virus would not spread. But I believe the message God gave me today about breaking the chains of isolation is about an unintended effect that having a lockdown world has had on many, many people. Some of them are us. Some of them are people who've unfortunately missed church for 12 weeks because of maybe no ability to connect, no phone, no computer, no online, connection. And so the world's been quarantined for several weeks. There are some who have rarely ever even left their home during this time. And their physical contact with others has been discouraged. And many have done, what we can do to stay connected through online services or Zoom meetings or Facebook Live or YouTube or whatever we have. But even with our ability to do that, how many would say it's just not the same? I know you're there at home, and this is what you have, and this is church for you this morning. That's why I encourage you, come back in here. We can have up to 150 here next week, and so be a part of church here if you're comfortable in doing so. And if not, continue to watch online. And we've been feeling the presence of God in our homes. I know my wife and I, we would worship in our sort of our living area there, and get in front of our computer and praise God together. And there's been some powerful times, but I think it just isn't the same as face-to-face human contact. And that was something we were born to have. And again, let me reiterate, I'm not challenging any government restrictions. I'm not telling you to violate anybody's 2 meter space. What was I about to say? I was thinking, in stores it's 2 meters. In Canada, it's 2 meters. In the US, it's 2 yards. I thought maybe we should do a biblical one for some of our signs around here and say, be sure to maintain 4 cubits social distancing, a good Bible word, from the Old Testament, and have 4 cubit social distancing. And so, but again, I'm not confronting any of those requirements. I think that it's wise that we would not want to knowingly spread a disease or not virus to someone else, but I'm confronting something that I think is not right, and that I think God thinks is not right. And that is the isolation that has come with all of this. And the isolation that's come around the world, it's simply not healthy. Let me give you a verse from Genesis chapter 2, right from the beginning of the Bible. And I know it's about Adam getting a spouse, getting a wife for himself, but Genesis 2 and verse 18, the Lord God said, "And it is not good that a man should be alone. I'll make a helper comparable to him." I want his words to sink down deep into your heart this morning. It's not good that a man should be alone. I know this was about God creating a companion and having Eve to be there with Adam, but I don't think any harm is done for us to look at the simple phrase, it is not good for man or woman or child or whoever to be alone. There's a principle there. And there's a principle that we can learn from. And the principle I want to talk about today is just about how isolation hurts. Isolation is not good. Isolation is not healthy. I understand isolating a virus, yes, but isolating ourselves and socially being disconnected, that's not healthy because we were not created to be alone. That's why God himself says it's not good for us to be alone. We were created to be connected to others. Psalm 18 and verse 1. Proverbs 18 and verse 1, pardon me. It says, a man who isolates himself seeks his own desire. He rages against all wise judgment. Now, we didn't necessarily choose to isolate ourselves. It was sort of forced upon us, but as we comply, we have to isolate ourselves. And look what the Bible says about doing that. It says it rages against all wise judgment. Jump ahead one there, guys. And so isolation rages, Proverbs 18 verse 1, goes against wise judgment. It takes away from a couple of things when you are disconnected from others. It takes what you could bring to them, and it takes what they could bring to you. See, we were created to be connected. And you have a gift in your life, and you have an ability, and you have something that you bring to the conversation or something that you bring to the group. And you know, when we're all isolated, that group just gets shattered. And it's not the same. And so when you live your life isolated, it robs us of the life we're called to live together, where we are called to be connected and not apart. Let me give you one more verse here. Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verse 9 and 10. It says, 2 people are better off than one, for they can help each other succeed. And if one person falls, he can reach out and help. But someone who falls alone is in real trouble. You know, I know in this day and age of Zoom meetings and Facebook Messenger and having that kind of online connection, well, if you fall and you're alone and then you grab your phone and you're like, help, you know, where's my Zoom meeting? I'm trying to find someone. It's not that's why God tells us to be connected. To be connected. And I know one of the mantras that's been said, you know, lots of businesses are putting this on their signboards. We're all in this together. We're all in this together. You know, that's been said over and over and over again. And I'm not trying to mock it. It's true. It's saying something, but it really isn't saying much. It's kind of like saying we're all on this planet together. And, you know, and yeah, we are, and we always will be. And yet, we've all been going through a strange time together. Yet one of the things that's been greatly taken away is the physical ability for people to actually be together. And yet, you know, everywhere it's being said, we're all in this together, but we can't be together. And so nobody would ever put that on a billboard. Nobody ever put, we're all in this together, separately, in our homes, actually kind of isolated, but together, sort of, in a weird way. You know, could you imagine that on a bill? No, it's not going to happen. See, isolation does weird things to us. It messes with your thinking. It does strange things to people. I've heard of people that say, you know, I'm struggling. I'm really dealing with some issues right now. And the isolation is getting to me. You know, for some, it made people go into the store and buy way more toilet paper than they ever are going to need for a very, very long time. Quarantine has a way of messing with your mind. Because that feeling of isolation is just not right. It's not something we were born to have to continually deal with, because we were not created to be alone. And so prolonged isolation is just not healthy. Just not healthy. And I'm not just talking about singles, but even family units being isolated from other family units, and even churches being isolated from other churches. You know, too long with, you know, maybe the same faces in the same house, alone, distanced from others, isolated, it's just not healthy. And again, I'm not talking about a virus today. I'm talking about isolation. And so please don't take the wrong message. Brad's saying we shouldn't be socially. No, that's not what Brad's saying. Brad's saying isolation is damaging. You know, do you know what happened? Wuhan, China, where people say is the source or where this virus originated, they were one of the first to come out of lockdown. And the first thing dozens of spouses did when they came out of lockdown was file for divorce. There were children who moved out of their parental homes, and they swore that they will never speak to their family again. That's crazy. Now, I'm not pointing out, I'm not prophesying doom and gloom, but what I'm doing is I'm pointing out the very negative effects or the unhealthy side of prolonged isolation. The Bible says it is not good for man to be alone. It's not good for a family to be alone. It's not good for a couple to be alone. It's not good for a church to be alone. Why? Because we were created to be connected. Now, I know we're connected. We're connected through Facebook Live. We're connected on YouTube. We're connected through our app. We're connected in those ways. But we need to be connected to humans face to face. That's how God made us to be. And you can connect being 4 cubits apart. That's okay. That's okay. Do you know what some of the offshoots of isolation are? It's fear, anxiety. People won't admit it, but a lot of people have a lot of fear right now. So, no, I'm not afraid. I'm just being wise. You know, there's a lot of distrust. There's a lot of people looking at other people as if they are the enemy. How many of you have coughed in Walmart in the last 12 weeks? You know, it's funny. I have a perfectly clear throat all day and not need to clear my throat or cough or have anything. And walk into the grocery store and immediately there's a tickle in my throat. I'm thinking, I gotta go in some abandoned corner of this grocery store and just clear my throat, because I don't want to be that accursed one who coughs in a grocery store and, you know, having looks of hatred, cast towards me. And so, you know, there's a lot of fear. There's a lot of us against them even though the mantra is, hey, we're all in this together. But isolation does crazy things to us. And I know all of the things that we're doing with the masks and the distancing, it's all to prevent the spread of a virus, but it really can evolve into something that it was never. Maybe, I don't know if the health experts intended it to become some of what it is, kind of almost like an us against them. I don't want to be too close to that guy because he could have the virus, and I don't want him to spread it to me. And there was a lady in Australia, she actually pulled a knife on somebody in a grocery store in a fight over toilet paper. And so, I'm sorry, but that's crazy world. It just is. And so for some, the we're all in this together is just simply not how they're living. It's more like, I'm in this for myself. And isolation is at the heart of that craziness. It is at the heart of that. So let me say it once again. It's not good for man or woman to be alone. How many of you ever seen that TV show called Alone? Any of you ever seen that show? It's a show that is about, so most of you haven't that are here in the building today, but it's a show about like survivalists, I guess, and they're people who get dropped off into the wilderness, and they're usually trained in some form of survival skills, most of them, and they know how to, eat the bark off a tree or start a fire with 2 sticks or whatever. And so the idea is the guy who can survive out in the wilderness the longest wins whatever the prize is. And so, these guys are sharp. I watched it the other day. I was watching one, and man, they were boiling water in a moose's stomach. There was some crazy stuff going on because they knew how to take care of themselves out in the barren wilderness. And yet, the name of the show is Alone. And they'll stay for days and days and days out there by themselves in the wilderness. And you know what? They can figure out all the things that relate to survival skills, how to keep themselves cold in sub-zero temperatures, or how to keep themselves warm in sub-zero temperatures. It's easy to keep yourself cold when it's cold. How to keep themselves alive and warm when it's cold out, and to build a shelter, and to build a fire, and to find food. And they can do all of those things. And yet, you know what causes a lot of people to drop out and to tap out of the show? It's the isolation. There's guys that are just excellent survivalists, and they know all the things about how to keep themselves going, and yet they're at day 22 or day 2, and they just say, I miss my kids so much, I quit. I miss my wife, I gotta get out of this. I'm going crazy by myself. What am I pointing out to? I'm pointing out that isolation isn't healthy. We were never made to be alone. We were never made to be alone. Did you know that feelings of isolation, and that's really what it is. Isolation is, the physical aspect of it, but it's the feelings of isolation that eat us up on the inside. And it's really more potent than actually being isolated, because perceptions are so powerful. Have you ever heard of this situation where there's somebody who maybe I've seen people post this on Facebook. They say, I have 357 Facebook friends, and not one of them wished me a happy birthday. So it's isolated but not isolated. It's that facade of being connected but you're not really connected, and that there's a feeling of isolation. A person can have 1,000 friends on Facebook but feel like they have no close friends. And so that's where the online thing just doesn't cut it. It's good, and if it's the best that we can do, let's do it. But face to face, 4 cubits apart, that's better. And so 2 meters, 4 cubits. Cubit is your elbow to your hand. And for me, that's almost 18 inches. And so it's almost exactly right. God created us to be social creatures. He really did. He didn't create us to be isolated. He created us to be connected. And one thing isolated people have had to do sometimes just to sort of maintain their sanity is sometimes create an imaginary friend. How many of you have ever had an imaginary friend? Not a one wants to admit it. There's that Tom Hanks movie from a lot of years ago, that movie Castaway, where the plane crashes and he ends up on the island. And so there was a volleyball on the island, and I think the volleyball blew up or whatever and looked like it had hair. And so he drew a face on it, and that became Wilson. And every day he talked to Wilson, because he was alone. And if he had nobody to talk to, he'd go crazy. And so, researchers have found there's all sorts of negative consequences to physical isolation. There's numerous mental health problems, panic attacks, paranoia. The isolated are more likely to feel depressed, less able to deal with stressful situations, actually become even more susceptible to illness. And again, I'm not trying to, if you're home and you're alone today, I'm trying to say, you know what, there's ways to be connected, and we'll get to a solution to this. Ironically, researchers have found that the more a person is isolated, it actually breaks down their immune system, causing it to respond differently to different viruses, which actually makes you more open to catching viruses. Strangely enough, the very thing that we're being told to do to stay away from viruses can actually make your immune system weaker so that you're more likely to catch a virus. That's crazy. And again, I'm not a medical professional, so don't quote me on that or anything, but I found all this on the internet. It must be true. And again, I'm not questioning anybody quarantining themselves if they have, and we should quarantine ourselves if we have symptoms of COVID-19, absolutely. I'm bringing up, again, my message today is not about a virus. My message is about prolonged isolation. It's not good. So I spelled out the problem. What's the answer? What's the answer? God has an answer to isolation. It's very simple. One word. It's called connection. It's called connection. He called us to be connected. And you can be connected online, and you can be connected through social media platforms, and you can be connected to an extent in a Zoom meeting, and that's all good. I think it hurts the heart of God when he sees his children, his people, his church being disconnected one from another. And so, because we were never created to be alone. Psalm 25, verse 16, in the New Living Translation, Psalm 25, verse 16 says this. The psalmist says, "Turn to me and have mercy." He's crying out to God. He says, "Turn to me and have mercy, for I'm alone and in deep distress." Being alone does that to you. It messes with you. And the psalmist found the answer to isolation. He found the key that breaks the chains of isolation. He cried out to God. And when you cry out to God, you're not alone anymore. And that's the first connection we all need to make, is just having that simple connection with God. To go it completely alone and, God sort of not in the picture. And I think that the unfortunate thing is for those that maybe haven't had a social media account or a phone or an internet connection and have been missing church for 12 weeks straight, their connection with God, unfortunately, has also somewhat drifted. Because church is a powerful place for us to build that connection with God. And so we need it. We need it in our lives. And I think of that simple phrase God says to us in the Bible over and over and over again, "I am with you." I went and did a little concordance search, and I found it at least 18 times. I'm not going to read to you 18 verses, but I'll read one to you. It is that God promises to be with us. He says, "I am with you." And that revelation is something we need. Every one of us needs to know, God, I feel alone. And he needs to be the one that's with us. It says in Isaiah 41:10, God says, "Fear not, for I am with you." Look what happens when we feel like he's not with us. Fear comes. That's why he puts those two things together. Fear not, because I'm with you. And then he says, "Be not dismayed." What else comes? Dismay, whatever that is. Being dismayed, discouraged. Be not dismayed, for I'm your God. I'll strengthen you. What else comes? Weakness. See, when we have that sense that God's not with us, we're going to be fearful, we're going to be dismayed, we're going to feel weak. He says, "I'll help you. I'll uphold you with my righteous right hand." And that's just one of many places where God says over and over and over and over again, "I am with you." Why? Because he doesn't want us to be disconnected. He said it's not good for us to be alone. Hebrews 13, verse 5, another way of saying it, God says he himself has said, "I will never leave you or forsake you." Sometimes we leave him, we drift away, we go away from him, we forsake him, but he promises, "I will never leave you or forsake you. And this is the biggest part of breaking the chains of isolation, is having that connection to God. If you don't have a connection with God, you know what? Before this service is over, you can have a connection with God. You can become reconnected to Him. If you've drifted away from Him, if you've walked away from Him, if you've allowed the connection to become so weak, it's like you can hardly hear His voice. He wants to reconnect with you today. And He wants to be connected with you today. And so that's the biggest part, to be connected to God. Just knowing that God is with me, I know that's what's allowed me to keep my sanity. I've preached the gospel in 30 plus nations around the world, and there are times where I feel that sense of aloneness that is devastating. It's crushing. I have one person in my family now, as my wife and I. Like, I still have a bigger, broader family. It's a growing family. I got a grandchild now, but they don't live at home with me. I live at home with my wife, and she's been my companion for close to 33 years. We've been married. And sometimes I'm 10,000 miles away from her, literally. And, unless you've been in that kind of a gap between you and the person you love the most on planet Earth, it's hard. And so having that thought, God says, I am with you. And you're not alone. And there's ways we can, FaceTime and whatever. But, in those times when I miss my family immensely, knowing that God is with me, man, that's what keeps me going, and yet there's another side to isolation. It's important to be connected to God, most important to be connected to God, but being connected to others. And, being isolated from others, not healthy. And I think one of the most socially isolated groups of Bible that you'd find, if you're looking for an example in the Bible, would be people who had leprosy. If you look at all the people, and leprosy is not a common illness in this part of the world in this day and age, but it still is very much in other parts of the world. And you think of the people in Bible days who had leprosy, they were considered contagious, and they had to keep their distance from others for fear that they would spread the disease. And their lives would have been so challenging, because in addition to struggling with the physical effects of a disease, they'd have to live with the social isolation that came with it. And so, it would have been so hard, if you had leprosy and you're walking down the street, mothers would grab their children and move them to the other side of the street. And it would be social distancing to the max. It would be more than 4 cubits. It would be serious staying away from these people. And so it's said that the lepers would have to walk down the street shouting, unclean, unclean, unclean. Could you thank God, COVID-19 has not come to that, that if someone had it or something, that we'd have to walk through Walmart shouting unclean. No, we've just been told, stay home. Now, I've ministered to people with leprosy. I spoke in a leper church in India a number of years ago. Now, I don't know if here in the house if this was working today, but those of you who are watching at home perhaps can see some of the pictures. Did we get it working, Derek, or anybody? Yeah. And so take a look at a couple of these places. Those of you who are able to see them, whether it's at home or here at City Center Church, it was a very unforgettable experience for me in India. Can we go back to go to that one? There's a fellow who lost some limbs. And I think in some ways, I'm not a medical doctor, but I think leprosy has an issue with your nervous system or your ability to feel feelings. And so sometimes someone can burn themselves and not feel it. And so that cut or that burn gets infected and eventually. So go on to the next one. There's a fellow that I'm not sure if you'll be able to see. Can you go to one of the next ones? Not moving? There it is. Yeah, I'm not sure if you were able to make it out, but this guy's leg is like leather. It just looks like, and this is what this disease did to this person. And in this part of the world, because of the religious customs and traditions, the leper is the lowest class of society, not even considered a human. Not even considered a human. But here's something that's unforgettable for me, is that through the church of Jesus Christ, through the gospel, those people who are the lowest caste of humanity. In fact, they're called untouchables or rat catchers, they're called in some parts of the world. That those people find their humanity in Jesus. And they actually are the most responsive group of people to the gospel of Jesus. Because what they've got in their world gives them nothing. And when somebody comes along and says, Jesus can heal your heart, he can heal you inside and out. You've got this physical devastating disease, but also you've had this social isolation your whole life, and everybody's wanted to keep their distance from you, but Jesus Christ loves you. That's powerful. I will never forget, I was in a huge church, a couple of thousand people, and I kept filling up and filling up and filling up. And what they often do when they have guest preachers is they sit them up in chairs that look like almost like thrones sometimes. You feel like, oh, wow, I'm the king today. And you're sitting in these nice throne-type chairs on the platform. And then the church got so full that they filled the floor and all the aisles in between the seats, and then began to fill the platform with children from orphanages. And so I'm sitting at the very back of the platform, kind of like this, and the whole platform has probably 250 kids on it. And what was so beautiful was seeing the very wealthy people from India coming in their bright, bright colored clothing, and sitting right next to them is a leper in rags. And Jesus breaks down every one of those walls. And he breaks every social distancing, isolation violation that the world would ever put on us. Again, I'm not talking about COVID-19. I'm talking about the damage that isolation does to people. Could you imagine living your whole life having to stay away from people? They say of those untouchables that if they drink from a cup, that someone in a higher caste in India will have to smash that cup and not drink from it again. If they sit on a seat, you can't sit on that seat until someone cleans it. Sounds like today. Sounds very similar to the world we're in today. But here's something. Can you get the pictures back up again? Because I forgot to say this. These lepers were given a piece of land through a great series of miracles. And in that land, they had a chalk line on the floor or on the ground where they said, this is where our future church will be. And many of them would build their own houses, like that one, exactly. Yeah, that's exactly what I wanted to show you. And so one of the men in the church said, I want to show you my house. And he was beaming because in his world, lepers don't have houses. And I will never forget, as long as I live, when he walked into his house, and it's not a very big house, and it's made of banana leaves or whatever, and he walks into his house, and he goes like this, and he just shows me his house. He's got a mud stove. He's got a bed. He's got a mosquito net. He's got a whole lot of possessions as far as this world goes, but he had a home. And it was sort of like somebody showing me the penthouse suite and, the nicest suite in the hotel, but it was him just so happy that look what Jesus has done for me. I love it. I love it. I love it. I love it. I want to share two stories real quick, or maybe even just one. I may only have time for one. I want to share a story with you of lepers coming out of isolation, breaking those chains off. And so there's one from the Old Testament. There was one from the New Testament, but I may not have time for that. So let's just look at this one from 2 Kings chapter 7. It's a story that's from a time of famine that was affecting the land. You think if you're the poorest of the poor and a famine hits a country, man, you were poor before the famine. You didn't have food before the famine. I have a friend in Venezuela. That country was hurting before COVID-19. He started feeding a dozen children. He feeds 250 kids every day during the midst of this. All those people were hurting before the famine. That's what it would be like with lepers. When the famine hits the country, the worst to be hit would be the very poor, and that would include those with leprosy. And so 2 Kings 7, verse 3 and 4 says, there were 4 leprous men at the entrance of the gate, and they said to one another, look where they lived. They just lived on the edge of town. And it says here, why are we sitting here till we die? That's what they said. Well, that's an isolation challenging question right there. He goes and he says, we will enter the city. He says, if we say we'll enter the city, the famine's in the city and we'll die there. If we sit here, we'll die also. Now, therefore, let us surrender to the army of the Syrians. That's who invaded their land in the middle of a famine. It says, if they keep us alive, we'll live. But if they kill us, we'll die. Now, I've preached an entire message on this story. I love this story. And I'm not going to go into great detail as we wrap up this message, but I want to point out that these leprous men didn't let their leprosy get the better of them. They didn't choose to be defined by it. They just figured, you know what? They raised a question. They went and said, we got to challenge this isolation. It ain't doing nothing for us. And so they challenged their isolation with this question: why are we sitting here until we die? Is that what our life is supposed to be? Are we created to just sit till we die? So let's come up with some scenarios, they said. And so they're in a hopeless situation. They got no food. They probably don't have a lot of money. And yet they refused to give up any hope. And they realized that even as lepers, they were created for more than what they were experiencing. We were created for more than isolation. We were created to all be sitting in homes, isolated. We were created to be connected. And for those lepers, man, it was bleak. Famines all over the place. They looked at their situation. Another nation had just invaded their nation. They're on the wrong side of that. They looked at their 4 options. Option number 1, go into the city, but the famine's there, we'll probably die there. Not a good option. Option number 2, stay here and sit here, but we'll probably just die here. Not a good option either. Option number 3, this is a pretty good one. Surrender to the invading Syrian army. They might kill us, but they might let us live. So that's sort of a half an option, and yet it's the best of the bunch so far. And then the 4th one was, we could surrender, we could surrender to them and they could let us live. So they had 4 options. They sort of had a 1 in 4 chance, or 3 out of the 4 options led to them dying. 1 of the options led to their survival. They decided to go for it. It wasn't easy for them because all those things about lepers being in public, it was frowned on for them by the rest of society for them to even go, and they weren't even, they weren't even going to friendly people. They were going to an opposing invading army in the hopes that these total strangers would let the poorest of the poor live. And there's an invading army coming into the country. Maybe they might let the rich people live, but would they let the poor people live? And then least of all, would they let the lepers live? And so it's sort of a really far-fetched situation. And so the Syrian army, why would they care about 4 impoverished lepers? So their chances are like slim to none, but it's a chance. It's a hope. It's something. And so let's read verse 5 to 8 here. As we wrap things up here, it says here, they arose at twilight to go to the camp of the Syrians, and when they had come to the outskirts of the Syrian camp, to their surprise, no one was there. For the Lord had caused, I love that phrase, the Lord had caused the army of the Syrians to hear the noise of chariots and the noise of horses and the noise of a great army. And they said to one another, look, the king of Israel has hired against us the kings of the Hittites and the Egyptians to attack us. And therefore they arose and fled at twilight, and they left the camp intact. Their tents, their horses, their donkeys, they fled for their lives. When these lepers came to the outskirts of the camp, they came into one tent and they ate and drank. It was probably like first food we've had in a long time. Whoa! And they carried from it silver and gold and clothing. I could just see these lepers, man, they're riding horses, they're just eating the best food. They're just like, wow, best day ever. It says they found the silver and the gold and the clothing, went and hid them, and they came back and they entered another tent, and they carried some from there too, and they went and hid it. And yet it all comes back to what it says in the start of verse 6. For the Lord had caused. And God made a big sound. And the Syrian invading army heard this sound, and they thought that the Egyptians were fighting the Hittites and that there was a bunch of chaos coming. And so they just hit the road and didn't even take their sandwiches with them. And so who gets to eat the sandwiches? 4 leprous men. I love it because God cares. Don't think God's not at work during a season of COVID-19. Don't think he's fallen off his throne. Man, for those who are willing to challenge the prevailing spirit of isolation that has been coming upon the world, God makes a way where there seems to be no way. Verse 9, this is the key. Got to get to this and then we'll close. He says, they said to one another, this is after they're enjoying some food, some drink, some tents, some new clothes, maybe try out some horses and donkeys, whatever. It's a great day. Some gold, some silver in their pockets, And then they go and say this in verse 9. They said to one another, we're not doing right. We're not doing right. This is a day of good news, and we remain silent. If we wait until morning light, some punishment will come upon us. Now therefore come, let us go and tell the king's household. Who gets to be the messenger of good news to the king in this story? 4 guys with leprosy. It's just, this is a radical story. And so the story of these lepers ends with these lepers going to the king with good news. Usually they'd be going, just saying, please help me or whatever. But they said, you know what? They're the bearers of nation-changing good news. And here they are heading to the king's household because they determined in their heart, we can't keep this good news to ourselves. It's not right. This is a day of good news, and we remain silent. So what's the principle we can learn from 4 leprous men? We can learn this principle is that God wants you free from isolation so you can free others from isolation. And right now, my heart breaks for people who've been without church for 12 weeks. Do you know some of them? Some of you are here today, and I'm so glad you are. Because that isolation is not what you were designed for. God didn't create your heart to be alone. He created for you to be connected. And, just the simple fact that maybe you didn't have a phone or you didn't have a computer or an internet connection or whatever, and you haven't been able to stay connected online like some of us have been able to. Well, see, that's great that you're here today. It's great that we've been able to open things back up. If you know someone who's isolated, can you give them a call this week? Can you send them a text? Say, we can go back. We have more meters of tape on the floor at City Center than will make your head spin. So we got arrows that'll throw you into complete confusion. No, they're good. They have a plan. They make sense to someone. So thank God. God wants you free of isolation so you can free others from isolation. Amen? Amen. If you've been isolated from God, maybe you're here today. You've drifted away from your walk with God. You've drifted away. You're at home. You somehow caught this online broadcast, and it's a time for you to make things right. It's a time to reconnect. It's really not that hard. It's like that psalmist when he cried out. He says, I'm alone. And yet he cried out to God. And God healed him and freed him of his isolation. Just that simple connection to God. Where he could go ahead and he could say, God could say to us and we could hear him and we could receive it. God says, I am with you. If you felt like God's not with you, today's the day to come back.